Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the panel on who gets to call Greater Boston home. We will wait a little bit for all the attendees to jump in and then we will be starting. Okay, so hello again. Welcome. This is the panel on who gets to call Greater Boston home. Simon Rios from WBUR, the Boston's NPR radio news station, will be our moderator today, and I will now turn it over to him.
Hello, all. Thank you for joining with us today. You got me in the middle of an assignment out covering some of the day's news, and I'm thrilled to participate in this event. I'm really hoping that it will be an interactive session. I want to hear from folks who are participating more than I want to hear myself speak as a moderator. If we could go around and one by one, I'll call the presenters off and they can just speak very briefly about where they work and what they do. So Sarah Philbrick, if we could start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Philbrick. I'm a senior research analyst at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And I do a lot of work sort of at the intersection of housing, transportation, and demographics, specifically looking at forecasting housing and transportation needs for the future of our region.
Thank you, Sarah. Next, Sebastián Sandoval Olascoaga.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sebastián, and I'm a PhD candidate at MIT. I work at the intersection of housing, health, climate change, and generally shocks. And I work with large-scale data sets and causal panel methods.
Okay, Forrest.
Hi, everyone. My name is Forrest Tangen. I'm a PhD student in public policy at Northeastern University. I also work at BARI. And my research really focuses on housing and property ownership. And happy to be here today.
Great. And then lastly, we have Nicholas.
Hey, everybody. I'm Nicholas. I'm a senior fellow at the Boston Housing Authority and a recent graduate of MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. My research focuses on housing as well as segregation and urban politics, and excited to be here today.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited at the idea behind this conference and this session. It seems to me as a reporter that displacement, gentrification, housing are really some of the fundamental issues that Boston is facing. I've seen it myself firsthand how it's affected my family in Boston. And as a reporter, starting at WBUR 6 years ago, one of the first significant stories I did was on just that, displacement in East Boston in this case. And it's just, as I've gone on, that's become the central, really for me, the central issue of interest in my reporting. I'm curious to hear how each of you came upon this issue. What was there an impetus in particular? Was it a natural progression? How did you land on covering, or I should say, studying these issues? Anyone feel free to speak up.
I can start, actually. I studied economics in school and was very interested in the idea of why people chose to live and work where they do. I worked with a historical economist at the time, and we were looking at Worcester in the early 1900s with the advent of the streetcar and where folks were clustered along the city and where they were working. We actually used World War I draft cards to figure out where people's place of work and place of home was. And that really got me interested in this idea of planning, and that people's decisions to live and work were not based solely on their own experiences, but the way that the city was structured and the way that racism and classism worked sort of made those decisions for people, and got really interested in planning as a profession, and started working with the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, where that work grew to modern day instead of historic patterns.
Right.
Yeah, I
I'll
think
call
for
on-
me, it was,
Yeah,
oh, go
for it.
ahead. Go ahead, Simon. Oh,
No, please.
I was gonna say, for me, it was shaped by two personal experiences. One was living in New York City at the height of the affordable housing crisis there, and seeing the displacement and gentrification that was happening all around me. But bringing it closer back to Boston, I grew up in Brookline and was very aware of the barriers in housing due to racism and the structure of the fragmented metropolitan region that we live in here that really prevented a lot of barriers to housing choice. And so when I moved back to study, do my PhD here, I was really driven by this question of how do we increase housing choice for folks to live wherever they want in Boston and around the region. And so that's how I got inspired.
Hey, let me ask Sebastian to step in here.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I grew up in Mexico City. I had experiences on displacement, and I realized how important is a neighborhood and how important is a house as an asset to get education, to feel secure, to get access to health. So throughout my life and as I was growing up, I realized how important it is and how important and fundamental it should be to provide this asset to people to thrive. So it was something natural for me to go there and start researching over there.
So the same issues exist in Mexico City. It's not just Boston. It's not.
Yeah, exactly the same issues, probably at deeper levels. Well, it's much more complex, right? And anywhere in the world. But yeah, I see similar things here in Boston as I saw in Mexico City.
I was in a conversation with somebody from Guadalajara, I think it was, and I had described, the gentrification as it was happening in Boston, and she said that's exactly what's happening in Guadalajara. I mean, who would have known? Certainly not me. But yeah, Forrest, tell us a little bit about how you came upon this kind of work.
Sure. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Rochester. And for those who aren't familiar, their campus is bordered on one side by a river and on the other side by a very large graveyard. And so it almost creates this bubble in which most undergraduates there don't interact with the community. And I myself am an avid runner. And so as I would get off campus and get out into the community, I would start to see very distinct neighborhoods. Rochester happens to be a very racially segregated and income segregated city. And so I would see those lines and it got me more interested. And so I ended up taking some courses and doing a research project looking at the housing court that was going on, and just really opened my eyes to the inequities that people in the community faced there. And so then, yeah, sort of bringing that same lens to Boston.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask one more question about your work, and then I'd love to open it up. I see we have, I think, 16 participants here. So that's always what I like to do most, to hear from other people. So you're all sort of at the forefront of different aspects, different angles on these questions around displacement and gentrification. Address this question: whose Boston is it? And we don't need to just talk about Boston, but the region. And talk about your work specifically, what the specific angles you're using to look at these questions. Since I have you on my screen for it, so I'll start with you.
Yeah, this is a question I grapple with a lot in my work, because one of the main questions I'm trying to ask is who actually owns properties and parcels, and what is the effect of that ownership on the conditions that tenants face. So I tend to look at that lens through the lens of rental properties and landlords, and looking at consolidation of properties and understanding how the landscape of ownership, of physical ownership, has changed over the years.
So is that the kind? I've noticed in my reporting that one theme that comes up always is it's about ownership. You know, the people getting displaced aren't the people who own. I mean, there can be pressures on them as well, like rising property taxes for people on a fixed income, for example. But it's like whether or not you own determines whether or not you're going to be displaced. Is that something that you see as well?
Exactly. Yeah. The power dynamic that exists when you rent, is definitely shifted towards the landlord, right? You don't have the ability to continue your tenancy if the other party doesn't agree, right? So that's certainly something that just by that nature will increase the turnover. But yeah, certainly the conditions of your living arrangement are different when you're renting than when you're owning, and you have more security when you own. Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I think I, have a similar idea to Forrest about this 10-year question, but we also at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council are really focused on a regional approach to what's happening in Metro Boston in general. And one thing that I study a lot is sort of these demographic shifts and which generations have opportunity, which people of different income groups have opportunity. And one thing we're seeing is there's a lot of older baby boomers who are sort of empty nesting, living in larger housing units because either they want to or they can't afford to downsize, or there's not opportunities for them to downsize in the communities where they want to stay. And so that sort of takes a lot of those units off the housing market for growing families who are then priced out of Boston, Cambridge, Somerville as well because of groups of adult roommates living together who can't afford to live by themselves. And so we have this mismatch between supply and demand of what unit, there's obviously a quantity issue as well, but even just the types of housing, people are sort of mismatched in the type of housing they need. We see families being squeezed into 2-bedroom apartments with 4 kids. And then we see older adults living 2 people in a 4-bedroom apartment because they can't find, or a 4-bedroom house because they can't find a sizable apartment in the community they want to live in. And so I think when I think about who's living here, I think a lot about that mismatch and how we can better plan for the decades going forward and give everyone the housing that fits them the best way possible.
Yeah. What are you researching now? You talked a little bit about this last time we spoke, but how does that pertain to the work that you're doing on a daily basis?
So some of the work I just talked about was based off of a paper we published over a year ago now about who's living in Boston's 3+ bedroom units. But we're actually doing research similar to the work that Sebastian is doing about who, not just flipping, but investors and what share of the market is being purchased as investment properties and how that changes the price dynamics in Metro Boston. We're also doing a lot of research about possible uncertainties for the future. So how things like climate change or demographic change or changes in migration rates could affect the region, and how we can plan for all of these different possibilities and making sure our policies and especially the things that we're advocating for in terms of funding and in terms of building new properties are sort of resilient to all of these different changes that might come in the next few decades. We do a lot of long-range planning.
All right. Sebastian, talk to us about your work and how it pertains to this question of who belongs here, whose city is this, whose region is this?
Right. So, okay, I'm trying to understand the phenomenon of house flipping. House flipping meaning you buy a house and you make some changes, or you don't, and then you sell it within less than a year. And I'm trying to understand who is buying from who are the flippers, to who these houses finish, from what type of housing were we buying from. And I am trying to understand if neighborhoods that were previously redlined actually are experiencing worse rates of house flipping here in Boston. And it turns out that yes, in previously redlined neighborhoods, we see these house flipping patterns that are higher than in previously non-redlined neighborhoods. So in here you begin asking yourself, who are the buyers? And I think it has to do with Forrest's research and who are what they selling from. And,
well, it sounds like fascinating stuff. I want to follow up with you and talk about, doing a story about this phenomenon, about your work, and Sarah as well. It looks like you're looking at similar issues. We're going to go to some video, but I want to hear first from Nick. You could talk a little bit about that same question, the work that you're doing, and how it pertains to the question of who belongs, who deserves to live here.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the research that I'm going to present today is really focused on the housing search process itself. So normally when we think about housing search, we think that folks generally have freedom to live wherever they want and have pretty good information about neighborhoods and units. But what research shows is that actually when we go to search for housing, we have a very limited set of knowledge about where we might be able to afford to live and how to find units. So let's take, for example, a family that wants to stay in Boston. Oftentimes the rents are going up incredibly fast in my neighborhood in the South End, right? So it's very difficult. A family might not know about a neighborhood right next door that they might be able to afford, and it might have good public transit. And so what we did in our research was I built a tool with the Boston Housing Authority, the Sasaki Foundation, and a lot of other foundation support. And what we found was that by building a tool that provided public transit information on schools and safety and other neighborhood characteristics, we're able to help families move to the neighborhood that they wanted to live in, whether that's in Boston or in the region. So I think my research is really addresses this question because it says we need to help families stay in the city who want to stay. We need to help families access neighborhoods with better schools if that's what they choose to do. And we shouldn't just treat the housing search process like it's a perfect information system. It's actually quite distorted. We know that families face incredible amounts of discrimination, whether it's from landlords or brokers. And we really need to be providing better tools for families to live in the neighborhood they want to live in.
Great, and it sounds like you're working on doing just that. I believe we have some video that we're going to present. Is that right?
Thank you all for coming. I'll be presenting my talk entitled Innovations to Expand Neighborhood Choice for Low-Income Families in Greater Boston. Now, during the Obama administration, there was a mantra that a zip code should not determine a child's future, but what zip code you're born in can profoundly shape your long-term outcomes. Here we can see how in Boston, according to data of 20 million Americans tracing their income from childhood to their mid-30s, that there are dramatic differences in upward mobility by place. And these differences are the direct product of a system of white supremacy in housing through practices like redlining that continue to perpetuate racial inequality today, including making these communities more at risk for COVID-19 through higher levels of social vulnerability. Now, ideally, every neighborhood would provide equally high economic opportunities, and consistent with the federal duty to affirmatively further fair housing, place-based solutions are essential to help invest in low-income neighborhoods. In this paper, I focus on mobility approaches, but these strategies complement rather than replace equally important place-based efforts. Now, I want to begin with a question here. How many cities and towns in Massachusetts do you think you can name? If you're like most people, you don't know many of them. And indeed, research indicates that all of us have blind spots when searching for housing. These blind spots can create limited choice sets that reduce economic mobility by denying families options to move to areas that provide increased economic opportunities. Voucher holders in particular face numerous barriers to accessing the neighborhoods of their choice. In addition to outright discrimination against people of color and voucher holders in particular, my work focuses on two additional barriers to voucher holders: affordability and a lack of information on schools, safety, and public transit. So in my research, I examined the question, what is the impact of 3 different interventions implemented by the Boston Housing Authority in 2019 on helping voucher holders access neighborhoods with higher performing schools and lower violent crime and poverty rates in Boston and Greater Boston. Of course, these metrics don't capture a number of community elements that families value most, from connections to family and friends to the importance of places with distinctive histories. Neighborhoods are much more than a series of metrics. The point with these metrics is, rather than eliminating those considerations, to complement them, those ties we already have with data. So the first intervention we made was to make every neighborhood affordable for voucher holders. By changing the ways the subsidies in the housing voucher program were structured, from one maximum amount by bedroom size across the entire region to one essentially set for every zip code, the entire region became affordable overnight, both enabling Boston residents to stay in their neighborhoods due to increasing rents there and helping families access more expensive communities. The second intervention was a housing counseling program meant to provide one-on-one search assistance to voucher holders and helping provide information on areas with increased economic mobility, as well as one-on-one counseling assistance. The third intervention was the Echo Housing Search Tool, which was motivated by a study that found that providing customized college recommendations to high-achieving low-income students could enable them to attend better resource colleges at a low cost. And so I asked, could information provided to voucher holders help them access neighborhoods with better schools and safer streets? I partnered with the Boston Housing Authority and worked to build a tool with generous support from the Housing Authority as well as Boston Indicators, the Boston Foundation, the Sasaki Foundation, and DesignX, as well as Xavia. And I partnered with homeless shelters that provide housing assistance for voucher holders to roll the tool out and test its effectiveness. So here's how it works. On the left here, you'll see what's called an isochrone analysis, which is essentially a heat map of transit times from specific destinations, showing you which areas are accessible via transit in a certain amount of time and which aren't. We then combine that with data you see here on the right with color-coded, easy-to-understand information on schools, safety, and rental unit availability for every zip code in the region. And here you can see how the tool works. You simply enter in the number of bedrooms you have, where you need to get to in terms of your job, whether you take public transit or a car, and then your preferences for schools and public safety. You then get custom neighborhood recommendations based on those preferences. You can scroll through every zip code in the entire greater Boston area, see which areas are close to you, which ones you can afford with your voucher, and other neighborhood characteristics that you might be interested to learn about. So to study the impact of this intervention and the other two I already mentioned, we first looked at the pre-post examination of zip code level subsidies provided to all voucher holders. We ran a randomized controlled trial of the Housing Mobility Counseling Program with 240 existing voucher families with children under age 12. And then we ran a randomized controlled trial of the Echo Housing Search Tool with almost 300 new families coming out of homeless shelters in greater Boston. In terms of results, what we found was that the zip code level subsidies were associated with moves to areas with slightly higher quality schools, and more importantly, a 1.6 percentage point increase in families moving to areas with very high performing schools and low violent crime rates. Secondly, we found that the Housing Mobility Counseling Program resulted in moves to areas with 0.19 standard deviation lower violent crime rates, and the results were even larger for families who actually moved compared to just movers, but there was a small sample size, so we couldn't detect a significant effect. When looking at the Echo Housing Search Tool, we did not find overall effects, but when examining families who said at baseline that they were interested in moving to an area with high levels of high school quality, low levels of violent crime and poverty, or interested in moving to the suburbs, we saw a much larger increase among those in the treatment group, basically showing that for families who were interested in making those moves, the tool was enabled them to make those moves to one of those neighborhoods. And in terms of implications, to conclude, among its many other consequences, the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown into stark relief the devastating impact of racial inequality in housing in the United States. Black Lives Matter, furthermore, has focused our attention on structural racism. This paper points the way forward for low-cost interventions that can help address racial inequality and create true equality of opportunity across neighborhoods in Greater Boston and around the country. Thanks so much.
Hi, my name is Forrest Hangen, and I'm a PhD student at Northeastern University and also an affiliate of BARI. And today I'm going to be talking about something we've done looking at the scale of ownership in Boston and specifically how this relates to evictions. I'll also be talking about a report that we co-authored with some partners at MAPC, including Sarah, who's also on this panel, titled Using COVID-19, the Responsibility of the Large Landlord. And I think many of us are aware that for months now we've been talking about the eviction tsunami or evictions. I wanted to explore the different types of landlords and their different propensities to understand how this to do this, we first need to understand a fundamental question. and that's who actually owns rent. Initially, this is like an easy answer, as these data are publicly available in tax assessments from the city of Boston. But to show how this is actually much more obscure and actually a difficult question to answer, I'll show you this little graphic here. So these are the 10 largest rental property owners. The red dots represent properties, and the gray circles represent ownership groups. And here's what this actually looks like in the tax assessments. So you'll see here as this transitions, it's actually made up of a much larger group of smaller entities. So we have things like single property LLCs, multi-property LLCs, and then we have a much more transparent group. So the Boston Housing Authority. And I'll sort of let this oscillate back and forth here so that you can see how these larger groups are actually made up of much smaller groups. And it's by just looking at the tax assessments, we get a skewed picture. And so to actually understand the true concentration of evictions and ownership of properties, we need to be able to pierce this corporate veil and understand the actual underlying structure. So that was the goal of this research project, to link corporation and understand that more accurate structure. So to do so, we link tax assessment records and corporations by standardizing the named entities between them. For example, taking things like corp and corporation and standardizing those both to corporation together. And then we're further to text match these together, so match tax assessment records to corporation filings. It's the individuals who are actually own and manage and operate LLCs or other corporate entities. And from there, we're able to link those corporations together by their shared individuals. So we can take a set of LLCs who own a set of rental properties and understand that they're actually an individual owner or set of owners. And this allowed us to the description of evictions by landlords and their size. So on the left here, we have individual owners, so these are named people, so like John Smith. On the right here, we have corporate owners, so an LLC, a group of LLCs that we've identified. And as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, we have small and medium individuals who make up about 88% in the city. So this is the overwhelming majority of landlords in the city. But they actually only own about 44% of the units in the city. And they're responsible for less than a third of the evictions. So their share of evictions is less than their share of units. On the other hand, we have large and very corporate owners who make up less than 2% of the landlords. A very small, a relatively small proportion of the landlords who own a similar proportion of units in the city to those small and medium landlords. Yet they're responsible for a much larger and sized proportion of evictions. So well over half of the evictions occur with these owners here. So as we think about being smarter from the COVID-19 pandemic and economic crisis, will our responses be strong enough? Will we still see that eviction tsunami? Will we think about seeing increased consolidation as we lose some of those mom and pop landlords? Maybe return to the pandemic status quo, or might this be an opportunity for continued assistance and an expansion of our social safety nets to help both sides of the ecosystem, tenants staying in their homes and landlords being able to maintain and continue to provide housing. These are questions that we will continue to explore research and as continues to unfold. For the sake of time, I'll wrap it up there. But thank you for listening. This QR code will take you to a copy of it if you'd like to take a look at that. And for those about this line of research, feel free to connect me on Twitter or by email. And again, thank you for listening.
Hello, my name is Sebastián Sandoval Lascoaga, and I'm a PhD candidate at MIT. Today I will present results from my research tracing the roots of modern-day house flipping back to 20th century redlining. First of all, I would like to thank the Boston Research Area Initiative and the PKG Service Center for their invaluable and generous financial support. Motivation. Besides its cultural relevance, house flipping affects the housing market. Currently, housing supply shortage and housing demand remain at historically high levels. In this environment, argue that house flipping, which is a situation where an acquired property is resold, often within weeks or months, crowds out first-time home buyers, and also that house flipping happens at higher rates in neighborhoods that have been historically discriminated. In this sense, the objectives of my research are threefold. First, characterize flipping patterns in the greater Boston area. Second, explore the crowding out effect due to house flipping. And third, understand if structural racism in the form of redlining impacts modern-day house flipping. Defining house flipping. I follow recent literature that defines a flipped sale as a residential real estate transaction sold at least twice in less than 1 year. Now, it is important to think of a flip as a flow involving two stages and three parties. That is, the back end of the flip, where a seller sells the property to a flipper, and the front end, where a flipper sells it to a buyer. In terms of data used in this research, I used residential transactions from the Warren Group for the counties of Eastern Massachusetts between 2008 and 2019, containing the main characteristics of each transaction. Now, let's begin with the results of my first objective. The following graph orders every transaction by its price from the lowest to the highest and places them into 100 percentile buckets. Within each percentile, I calculated the percentage of transactions that were flipped. As seen in this graph, house flipping occurs more often among lower price properties. For example, at the 5 percentile, almost 20% of all sold properties were flipped. In terms of the identity of parties involved in the flipping process, flipping is mainly conducted by entity accounts, such as LLCs or trustees, while the final buyers of a flip are mostly white. This flow chart shows us that, starting from the left, around 60% of sellers of a flip are white. Not shown in this graph is that 50% of those sales among people of color were foreclosed. In the middle, the flippers, we notice that 60% of them are entities. Finally, at the right side of the graph, one sees that 80% of the flips were bought by white people. Now, regarding my second objective, I begin with these two graphs that organize housing transactions again by price percentiles. The graph on the left shows us the median return of investment for a flip property within each percentile. For example, for the least expensive flip properties, there was a 150% return of investment. While the one on the right, this graph, shows us the same statistic but in dollar terms. We notice that flipping is a lucrative activity, especially at the lower price spectrum, where entities tend to buy most properties, again, not shown in this graph. Now, this graph shows us how house flipping catapults properties from the low end of the price distribution to upper percentiles. The x-axis depicts the price percentiles of flipped houses before being flipped, while the y-axis shows us where they lie after being flipped. We notice that a flipped property tends to jump 20 percentiles on average. That is, holding everything else constant, house flipping tends to reduce the supply of affordable housing. Finally, in terms of my third objective, a potential pathway in which structural discrimination in the form of redlining affects house flipping is the case where redlining creates these investment trajectories and segregation in redline neighborhoods, which impacts place-based resources in that community, creating negative feedback loops and increasing the likelihood of experiencing house flipping in later times. Now, to study the impact of redlining on house flipping, I use a methodology called spatial regression discontinuity design, where, for example, I compare housing transactions at a specific buffer of a boundary, in this case, between red line and yellow line, and compare the flipping rate in this buffer while controlling for other factors. In here, for example, I compare sales between the blue-lined areas and the yellow-lined areas, and again, within the buffer. In terms of the results, I found a strong and statistically significant effect of redlining on house flipping between yellow and blue-lined areas. That is, on average, very close to the border, yellow-lined areas have 4% more house flips than blue-lined areas, holding everything else constant, whereas red-lined areas tend to have 1.2% more house flips than yellow-lined areas. Finally, despite being statistically insignificant, there is a very strong effect of redlining on house flipping between yellow-lined and green areas. On average, there are 14% more house flips happening in yellow-lined relative to green-lined areas. In contrast, there is no difference between green and blue-lined areas. Remember that these ones are the best rated neighborhoods. Now, to summarize, in this research, I found that house flipping is an economic activity that reduces the supply of affordable housing, which is mainly conducted by entities and in general is bought by white individuals. I also found that redlining has a strong effect on house flipping between the worst and best rated neighborhoods, especially in yellow-lined areas. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Sarah Philbrick. I'm a senior research analyst at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And today I'm going to talk about a few COVID-19 economic recovery scenarios that we created in the summer and fall of 2020 to help plan for housing demand and economic development in Metro Boston. We examined a range of possible 3 to 5 year economic recovery scenarios that could help us identify responsive housing and economic development policy strategies. So before COVID-19, when we did planning, we projected continued economic growth in the Metro Boston region and really talked about the main suppressor of this economic growth being a lack of housing in the region. Most of our housing work emphasized housing productions at all income levels. But then when COVID-19 hit, there were a lot of things we knew at the time and more things that we didn't know. So some of the things we knew included how many people were collecting unemployment. But in addition to the things that we knew, there's this long list of things we didn't know, including how long the pandemic would last. This is before we had any information about vaccines. We had no idea how long the region's universities would have online classes, how many businesses would have to close, etc. And so we decided to take a scenario planning approach where we looked at a few different uncertainties in our region and thought about what is the range of possible outcomes of what economic recovery might look like in the next 3 to 5 years. So we had 3 major axes of uncertainty: the percentage of the labor force that would be laid off, what that income distribution or really occupational distribution of those workers who are laid off were, and what the spatial distribution of those laid off workers were. So as a result, we wound up creating 5 different scenarios that we were using for this type of analysis. The names of these aren't really important, and I'm not going to go into each one in great detail, but you can see from this first bullet point is really about how quickly the economy recovers, what our unemployment rates are, 3 to 5 years from 2020. So we thought the lower end of that would probably be like what unemployment looked like before the pandemic, around 4.5% unemployment. And at the high end, we looked at unemployment rates of about 14%. We also looked at the distribution of what those unemployment rates by occupation could be. So in some scenarios, the unemployment rates by occupation looked very similar to the way they did before the pandemic. In other scenarios, we assumed that service industries continued to be hit hardest. In other scenarios, we thought layoffs might happen more equally across all sectors if we sort of go into a more equal recession across the economy. And then this third bullet point is really about where people in the region are. So if folks have more of the ability to work from home, they might move outside the core of our region, which is sort of, this Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and surrounding areas. In other scenarios, we might have laid off workers who decide to leave the region altogether. And so we tried to quantitatively capture what these different scenarios might look like in terms of the number of households in the region and the number of households who might need housing assistance, what the demand for housing at different income levels look like. I won't go into the methods in great detail, but we use the public use microdata from the American Community Survey, or PUMS data, and that data is weighted. We use those weights to expand the data set into a full synthetic population. We then distinguish between student and non-student households and assigned layoff counts by industry based on those scenario assumptions, and randomly selected people within those occupations or industries to be laid off. We then calculated the lost income due to layoffs per person in that household. So if a household had 2 restaurant workers that we simulated would be laid off, we subtracted those wages from the total household income and saw what that did to the resulting household income. So this chart shows the unemployment rate by each scenario and occupational code. And you can see the pretty big range that we looked at. For example, if you look at food preparation, this sort of highest one in the middle. In the lowest scenario that we looked at, unemployment rates for this sector are about 7.5%, and in the highest scenario, they're over 30%. So these vary quite a bit. And after simulating that, we wound up with results for each scenario across a number of different metrics. This chart shows the households impacted by layoffs and their resulting AMI. So not only in this scenario where we have higher unemployment rates, we see more households impacted by layoffs, but you can see that the distribution of households by AMI categories tend to change across the scenario. So those in darker blue having higher AMI. And what we thought was a little remarkable is that across all of these scenarios, there will be households with higher AMIs who are impacted, which has implications for the type of housing assistance we need. If these households are more likely to bid for sort of naturally affordable housing, they might outprice people who are living in those housing units today. There's a few limitations just in the way that we're calculating all of this and our methodological approach to this question. We found that total unemployment rates in our scenarios played a much larger role in determining how many households need assistance going forward than the distinction of layoffs by occupation. And this could be due to some occupations having pretty big variation in the wages that people in that occupation see. There's also a pretty big difference in the relative size of occupations in the study area. So even if there's 30% unemployment in an occupation, if that occupation is a really small share of Metro Boston employment, that's not going to make a huge difference overall. Our methods also apply layoffs to a population of workers in a particular occupation randomly, so we don't reproduce the impacts of racism or sexism that might indicate who is being laid off in the actual labor force. So we've been using these results to sort of think about what recovery looks like. We have a lot more answers today than we did when we started this project. So we've been able to rely more on the actual data that we're seeing coming out of the state. But I think this is a really interesting approach to thinking about recovery going forward and the ways of approaching things that we don't know a lot about.
Well, thank you so much. If the presenters could each turn their video back on, unmute themselves, that would be great. At this point, I'd love to open it up to the rest of the group, the people who are in attendance. So much information there, really learned a lot. It's incredible the depth of your research and what it tells us about what's happening in the city. But yeah, let's open it up. I recognize some of the people in attendance. Would love to hear your thoughts, any comments, or any questions you have for the presenters.
There is a question in the Q&A, Simon, if you want to check.
Okay. I'm not seeing that. Can you ask the question, Alina? I don't see any questions in the Q&A.
Sure, yeah. So it's from Bill Wendell, and he says the title of today's panel assumes that people want to call Boston home, but wonder if COVID is challenging that assumption. Estimators vary, but at a minimum, 1 in 5 people are now working from home, and 40% plus of them plan to move post-pandemic. And he is quoting something that says remote workers are more likely to be planning local moves as well as moves to a new city.
Some great questions there, Bill. Thank you. Do any of the panelists want to take a crack at that?
I could maybe speak to it quickly. In some of the data we didn't present, we did surveys of folks who were receiving a voucher for the first time, and we have pretty good data on where folks wanted to live. So about 60% of folks receiving a voucher from the Boston Housing Authority wanted to stay in Boston. So that's a pretty significant majority, and it's really important that we help families, make those moves. On the other hand, 40% didn't, right? They wanted to live somewhere else in the region. So I think we need to acknowledge that people have different preferences about where they want to live. I think in general, the majority of folks who live in Boston want to stay, and we need to help prevent displacement to help that happen. But we can't pretend that everyone wants to make those moves. And I think we need to help folks live wherever they want in greater Boston, whether it's in Boston or not.
If I may, I agree with Nick as well. I think I see it as a good thing that people are wanting to move more, because on one side, people that are actually moving to the suburbs are, if I haven't read the literature, but they are high income earners, so they're the ones actually putting pressure in prices here in Boston. So if we see people moving out from the city, that could actually help us to reduce the house pressures or the supply pressures that are actually here in Boston, and could actually help us, as Nick said, 60% of those people afford lower prices in the city. It's a great question. I think it's something that we should keep researching in.
Just to be clear, we don't have any indication that that's actually happening yet. It could be happening on a theoretical level, but we're still seeing prices continue to go up most likely because of the supply and demand situation.
And I think what we're seeing in some other major cities across the U.S., and this could be true in Boston, it's a little hard to tell so far, is that not that we have a mass exodus of people leaving the city, we just have fewer people moving into the city. Cities are used to this churn, but because of the pandemic, we have less folks moving into the city. And this is why our research in particular was curious about looking at students and non-students, because if schools are remote, that makes a really big difference for the Metro Boston housing market. If people if students are working remotely from their parents' houses or other places in the country. I don't think that will happen long term, but I think this question of not just who wants to live where, who already lives here, but how many people are we attracting to the region, seems to be the biggest difference happening with the pandemic right now. And I think once things ease up, that will change.
For those of you who have looked at the question of foreign investment, that we hear about these half-empty developments going up in different parts of the city. Is there any indication that COVID has slowed that down at all, or do we not know that yet?
I think that's very much an open question, and I think something that we're definitely interested in looking at, sort of in the future. And I think a lot of these data come out on a yearly basis, so we'll have to wait sort of till the end of this year to potentially answer some of those questions. But yeah, certainly it's a possibility. It's also a possibility that, and I've been hearing anecdotally from people who have been trying to buy houses in the area that people are coming in with cash offers way over asking price, right? It's really hard to find homes for sale, and part of that might be because there's less people trying to sell at this time, or various reasons. But part of that also might be more institutional investors, picking up some of that housing that ordinarily would have gone to individuals. So yeah, it's definitely an open question and something that we'll have to look into in the future.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I mean, for a long time, we've talked about this kind of stereotype of the wealthy student coming to study, and instead of buying or instead of renting, they decide to buy something, and then that prices out the first-time home buyer. That's a really fascinating question. Is COVID going to disrupt that? To what extent is that really the cause for a lot of the demand that we see in the city? I don't know. And if it is significant, to what extent is COVID gonna slow that down? Any more questions from the group?
Yeah, so we have a few more questions. I will just say.
I see them now. I see them now.
Okay, good.
For some reason, I didn't see Bill's.
Okay.
So I'll go over. Let's do these quickly because we have just a few more minutes here. So one attendee said, in terms of evictions, are there differences in cause of eviction from a small property owner to a large property owner?
Assuming that's directed towards, yeah. That's something that we haven't looked at yet. So my intuition, but again, I'll preface that this is my intuition, in that some of those causes might be, we might see more causes due to non-payment of rent from large property owners, due to the fact that they have like less of a personal relationship with their tenants and maybe less willing to work with them on payment plans or mediation or things like that. Whereas if your tenant lives downstairs, you might be more willing to work with them on if they're behind on the rent.
That makes sense. Another attendee asks, in terms of flipping, are there policies in Boston or on a regional state level to discourage flipping? So for example, a required notice to tenants, an option to buy, tenant working with local banks to access capital, and or programs educating tenants about opportunities to build wealth.
Yeah, thank you for your question. There are, from what I know, there are at least two policies that are going on nowadays. In New York, the most natural one is they are actually taxing this type of sales. They are taxing at higher levels. I'm not saying that I support it, but that's one. In California, for example, they are, when a house is being sold by someone that is living there would like to buy it, they are actually giving them some time between selling the house in the open market for them to actually go and buy this house. So they're actually giving a time before selling them to investors, as far as say. But at least those two are in my mind. Also, there are other policies to actually protect people to not sell their properties before the need of selling them, before actually experiencing the need to sell them, helping them through social policies, helping them through other mechanisms. So there are several things that are happening nowadays.
And just to add on to that from Sebastian, there was a law passed by the legislature in Massachusetts, the Tenants' Right of First Refusal Act, that was then vetoed by the governor, that would have allowed cities to pass bills that would have allowed tenants to buy in the houses they lived in, to make the first bid at the market rent before it went on the open market. So hopefully that could be instituted in the future too.
All right, Heather Hoffman asks, did anyone's research look at how much housing is empty? That is something that came up, and what the reasons are. Heather says, I know that there's some amount of housing that has been bought for investment purposes, not to live in, and that has an effect on all of the businesses in the area that need people around to patronize them. And then Heather says she assumes that there's a large amount of housing. If this is a large amount of housing, that it dramatically affects availability for people who do need somewhere to live. I know this is something you guys are all thinking about, but who wants to address that?
I can address that. I mean, it's a research question we are currently working on, but have a lot of data issues to actually answer. So there is a form I guess it's a form that you can fill out called a Declaration of Homestead to say, this is my primary address, this is where I live. And we've been doing some work to try to match that data to sales data to figure out, okay, when a person is buying this, are they saying that it's their primary address? There's no like identifier that matches those completely. So we've been trying a lot of like fuzzy text matching with addresses or dates. They're also not filed at the same time. So it's still, our match isn't good enough right now to say what % of the market that really is. But there have been quite a few stories, in the newspaper, in the Globe over the past years, I think even NPR in the past year, talking about, the big towers downtown and how they are being bought for investment properties. So it's definitely something we know anecdotally is happening, but we don't, or personally, I don't know of anyone who's actually been able to quantify what % of the market that is. I'm curious if other folks, and that's research we would love to partner with folks on if they have better methods than we do of trying to match those two data sets.
Has anybody found a way? This has come up for me as well. Like, how do you quantify the level of foreign ownership of property in Boston? I don't know. Does anybody have any solid, like, there's no database or data set that shows the countries of origin of, ownership. Does anybody have any way to get a closer sense of what's going on here?
So some of that is a little bit available, but it's obscured. So like I mentioned in my research, right? If you know the LLC, we now have access to corporation data that tells us the names and if it was properly recorded, the addresses of the individuals who own that LLC. So some of that we can get at, but it depends on the data quality and whether or not they actually recorded that or were actually truthful in that recording. So it's some of that data is starting to come to light, but it's still very difficult and very messy.
So conceivably, if you look up the LLC, if it's somebody in China, say, would it give you their address in China, or would it go back to like Delaware, something or other?
Yeah, so again, it depends on how they did it on their end, right? If they used some legal office in, say, Delaware, then that's where it's going to stop. But if they put their, it depends on how they did it on their end.
Well, that's something to stay in touch on, because it seems like a tough nut to crack, but an important one. So let's see, Sebastian Zapata asks, and we have to end it really quickly here. I have two more questions. In fact, I'm going to read the two questions and we'll do like a lightning round if we could. So Sebastian says, I'm curious to hear thoughts around solutions to prevent or extract resources from house flipping, considering it disproportionately impacts lower income communities of color in Boston, and reducing naturally occurring affordability. Great question. The final question that I have here is, says, thank you all for your great presentations today. Did you learn anything from each other that you think will help with your research moving forward? Let's start with the first question.
That's a great question. And I think we lightly touched it before. I see, well, there are two possibilities. As Nick said, there are place-based policies and people-place-based policies. You can help people not to go into these situations where when they face the need to sell actually their property, or you can actually help the place to kind of thrive or to kind of excel. We could spend hours discussing about the pros and cons about this, but there are certainly a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, I think one thing we were particularly concerned about with the pandemic was seeing what happened in 2008, 2009 happen again, where people were forced into foreclosure or pressured into foreclosure due to their economic situation, and then investors and banks sort of snatched up those properties and flipped them. And we haven't been seeing that as much today as we did back then, but I think that was a really big warning for us, and we need to be thinking about that, that first piece of helping owners keep homes that they want to keep is a really big part in making sure that that naturally occurring affordable housing doesn't get lost.
Right, so let me flip to that final question, and maybe each of you can just comment very quickly on what you heard in each other's presentations that might impact your own research going forward.
Yeah, I can quickly go. I think everyone's research was fabulous, and the data sets you used were really unique. I was particularly interested in your project, Sebastian, using spatial statistics around redlining to study present day impacts. I think that's really innovative, and I think just shows the legacy of those policies that happened 70 years ago. So excited. I have a lot of questions for you, so I'm excited to talk offline and learn more. But thank you all the panelists for excellent work.
Yeah, agreed. I think all of this research is really relevant and innovative, and we've actually, Forrest and I partnered on that project, but we've also been in touch since then when we got eviction records to do the same type of analysis to sort of figure out, if evictions were coming from large landlords who had different LLC names and things. So I think just that method in itself is so useful for analyzing the role of large landlords in the region going forward.
Yeah, just to echo that, like I think to the extent to which we can, make data available and methods available that we can, collaborate and ask and answer these questions that we've discussed today. So I think being able to convene together and hear from each other is just a great opportunity. Really appreciate all your thoughts.
Yeah, I love everybody's research. Very important. And for example, forest research it's something very complex, and it gives us kind of the stark reality of who owns these transactions. And Nicolas' research is also amazing because it's not just that you need to have good intentions, but it's like a very huge leap between actually implementing a policy and actually enacting the policy. And how to incentivize people to actually do something is very hard. And Sarah's research is something phenomenal in terms of how to think about shocks and how to adapt ourselves and how to foresee and how to look to the future.
Yeah. Well, I hope to stay in touch with all of you. It's something that's been on my mind for a long time, is to be more plugged in with the academic community, and this was a great introduction to that. So I genuinely hope that we can stay in touch, and as you come across these wonderful things, we can, not wonderful things, wonderful ways of looking at very difficult things, that we can look at ways of covering them. So thank you so much, and I believe that concludes our session for today.
Thank you
Thanks
so
so
much,
much,
everyone from Barry's side. Thank you to our moderator, our panelists, and our attendees. And we hope to also see you next week when we have a great keynote on research policy under a new mayoral administration. You can check our website for more details. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.